So let's move into mountains. Mountains are a pretty obvious structure, maybe unlike some of the faults that we've talked about in the past, but mountains are visible landscape features, and they are definitely a great example of plate tectonics because they're visual, they're very easy to see. And there's three processes we're going to talk about in forming mountains. It's going to be uplift, deformation, because we're obviously squeezing these rocks together, and then because we're squeezing those rocks together, they're undergoing a lot of pressure, so we're also going to talk about metamorphism. So mountains are typically found in really long linear belts. We call these orogenic belts. So on our continent, there's two orogenic belts. We have the Appalachians over here, and we have the Rockies. Now the Rockies are a little weird because they're a little bit wider, so we're mainly going to talk about the Appalachians. If you want to learn about the Rockies, you can take my Geology 102 class, which I know you're all going to do, because they form in a little bit different manner. But everywhere you look, right, you notice that these mountains tend to be these really long linear belts, right, that are along plate boundaries. So that's again pretty important there. So mountain building involves a lot of processes. We're going to talk about deformation, right? As you can see in here, my rocks are folded, right? They're not nice and flat. We're going to have breaking, and we can have different kinds of breaking of our rocks, jointing and faulting. Our rocks can also fold as well, so we're going to talk about that. Sometimes there's enough pressure that it causes our rocks to kind of melt a little bit. Maybe I'm going to get metamorphism, so I might get foliation as well, because remember, mountain building is a regional type of metamorphism. And then, of course, later on, after they've formed, if I'm up in the mountains, I'm probably going to get glaciers, definitely erosion, and sedimentation. So we have to realize is that it's a constructive plate boundary or plate tectonic process to build these mountains back up. And right, these last three that we talked about are destructive processes which tear them down. So orogenic belts, right, mountains, don't have a finite lifespan. Mountains just haven't always been there, right? The Appalachians just haven't always existed. The Rockies haven't just always existed. They form. And when they form, right, and when they're very young, as those continents collide, they're going to be very tall. Over time, erosion, glaciation, sedimentation is going to wear them down. So as they get older, they definitely get much smaller. And eventually a mountain will wear away until it's completely flat ground. So when we look at the deformation inside of a mountain, so we're going to kind of go into, we're going to zoom into what the rocks are going to be doing here for a little bit over the duration of what I want you to learn this week. And then when I come back from my trip, we're going to talk a little bit more about the big overall scale. Let's get into the rocks, and we can see several things. We can see two different types of fractures, a joint or a fault. Joints are fractures that don't move. Right, so our rocks are undergoing so much pressure or so much stress that they just have to break, right, in order to relieve that stress. Sometimes we can get a fault where there's so much pressure that not only do my rocks break, but they also move, right, to relieve the pressure. Our rocks can also undergo a plastic deformation, which is folding, right? So if my rocks are a little bit warm, instead of breaking to relieve the stress, they can just fold to relieve the stress. And then if we're talking about metamorphism, which definitely happens in some of our mountain belts, we're certainly going to see foliation patterns, right? Our slate, our phyllite, our schist, and our gneiss. So deformation definitely changes the characters of the rock, right? We can go from looking at an undeformed rock bed where my layers are nice and flat. You can see I've got a good contact there between them. Right here's a sand. You can see all those grains are nice and round and right next to each other, to where they're deformed, where you can see that the rocks have been pushed together, right, flattening out those grains. You see here that I've definitely got, right, some folding that's going on in here as well. My rocks are not nice and flat anymore. So we're going to talk about how these changes occur.